Hey, today I'm going to show you how to code qualitative data using software. And of course, you will not be using software for this class to code data, but I wanted to show you a little bit about how it looks in general when we as researchers do this. So qualitative data comes in a lot of different forms, and the analyses come in a lot of different flavors, and we are going to focus on looking at narratives and interviews and things like that, because those are the types of data that you would probably come into contact with most frequently in work within your field. So qualitative data can actually be a number of different formats. Here I am using interview data from girls who were in a juvenile justice facility, and I conducted life history interviews with them, asking about their victimization experiences and their crimes and everything else. And so this is the interview, one of the interviews that I'm scrolling through. But keep in mind that qualitative data isn't just interviews. It could be visual, it could be auditory. You could listen to these transcripts as opposed to look at the text. And this program allows you to do that. You could code social media posts. You could code parts of a photograph where you drag and drop sort of a square over parts of the photograph and then could code parts of that. And you could code videos. So there are a lot of different ways that you can code data within these qualitative analytic programs. What I usually begin with is just a raw transcript. So this is just completely blank and none of these codes are here. For illustrative purposes, I'm showing you one that's already been coded. And the way that I typically will show this occurring is I will have provisional codes, which are my codes based on my interview prompts. So I ask the girls about their charges, I ask them about their living environment, different relationships in their lives, their alcohol and drug use, crime and delinquency, victimization, mental health, turning points of their lives, and things that they're proud of or thought were their strengths. As I coded each of those things, which were from my interview prompts, I started to find more nuanced things within each of those codes. So for instance, crime and delinquency, I established separate subcodes for each type of crime and delinquency. So this wasn't specific to my interview prompts, but I decided I wanted to have separate codes for running away and truancy and child support and so on. So what you do to code is you just highlight text and then you just click over here and it will bring up something for you to establish a code. So let's say that individual is 13. I think that's middle school age. So let's say I wanted to have a code for middle schoolers. Anything having to do with middle school aged mentions. Okay, and then I would code that a certain color, like yellow or something like that. And so then you see I have that code there. And so I could then drag the code over here, and I've highlighted that. And you can see as you click on each code, you highlight what is coded with that code. So there I've got my middle school code. I'll go ahead and delete that so it doesn't mess up my data set there. Are you sure you want to delete? Okay. And so you've got your provisional codes that you develop from your prompts, and then those other codes that are within that are what would be more referred to as emergent codes. And you don't need to know the terminology, but that's just for your information. And that emergent type of coding is more what you see in what's called grounded theory, where you're sort of coding from the ground up, from the words up, as opposed to from the prompts down. Um, and so you can take your codes, you can actually shuffle them around and reorganize them. I could move this up here if I wanted. I could move the subcodes all around if I wanted. And that really helps you figure out how you want to organize this for your write-up. So if I decided that I wanted to write it up in a different order than the way I've got things laid out here, I could start reorganizing the codes in a way that facilitated that. You could also use visualization tools. And one thing I like to use is the Code Matrix browser. And so that'll show me which participants mentioned which codes. So you can see there are the first few participants there. And we have little dots of different sizes for how many times they mentioned each of these topics. And you could actually break that out and see for the subcodes too if you wanted. And you could change that so it could read into numbers if I want to see actually there were 40 mentions of relationships in that first interview, and 64 in the next interview mentioned to relationships. You could see, for instance, the third interviewee seemed to mention substance use a lot less than the second interviewee. So you could see those things with your visualization tools. You could do a document map that sort of, or actually not a document map, let's go to the document portrait that shows you this particular case that I'm looking at, the order of the codes in terms of the color that they're coded. So you could see that this girl started out talking mostly about her living situation or alcohol, drug use, and her crime very much at the beginning, then moved into talking about relationships. She then moved down to talking about other topics here. I think certain things I have in here, victimization, I think I have certain things coded as red that are traumatic, but I can't find it there, but you could see it highlighted in that document. So you could tell by your color coding of what colors you've established for each code, what order they appear in the document. And you could actually compare documents along those dimensions as well. If your program doesn't freeze up. Hi. All right. So anyway, we will not show you that. Oh, we will show you that comparison. Okay. As you can see, when you are looking through this data, it might seem like you really aren't sure what to use as your codes. Codes could be anything. They can be behaviors. They could be, as you see here, types of crimes, types of victimization, mental health issues. They could be more abstract ideas. They could be processes. If you are in a different field, you might be coding about communication patterns and who is an active communicator and who is a passive communicator and so on. And so you could code about all different types of things. One of the key things is to try to talk with another individual about the codes so that you establish some sort of consensus, and that creates sort of a check on your subjectivity during this process. So here we go, our comparison of documents. So here is the interview one, and you can see the order of her mention of codes versus this interview. You can see all their mention, and you can see this person mentioned lots of traumatic things right up front in their interview. And this actually could be useful if you're looking for particular types of cases that mention certain things, or if you're looking for mentions of certain types of things. So for instance, I know a researcher who has coded the presidential debates and looked at how often people mentioned certain themes like immigrants or America, or talked about themselves. And so he could then see which candidates were most likely to speak about those things based on the color codes. But as you code, you will start to come up with an idea of what your code list is over here, and then you compare your code list to another coder who has been looking at the same transcript, and y'all talk a little bit about which codes you established, why you established them, where you see similarities, where you see differences, and then if you see that, several members of your team were coding child abuse in one area, but one member wasn't, that's sort of an indicator that y'all might need to tighten up your definitions. And so you figure out where y'all were not on the same page in terms of that code, and you create a tighter definition so that you can all be coding on the same page throughout the data set. And so that is called consensus coding, and that's one of the areas where you can sort of do one of those checks on trustworthiness of your data so it's not as subjective of a process. In any case, this is just a brief illustration of what you could do with qualitative software. And beyond the visualization, another thing that you could do is bring up specific types of code. So if I want to see any code about crime and delinquency, I could click on that code. It brings up this table, and I could click through every single person's mention of crime and delinquency in the entire data set. And that really helps you bring all the information together. So if you were writing up something just about the mentions of crime and delinquency, you've got it all there in one place where you can actually draw it together into a report. So I hope this has been helpful, and thank you for joining me in this illustration of qualitative coding.